Hello chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today. Today's monster has been a long time coming. Here we have the Porsche 356 with the engine from the Porsche 959, pumped up to over 800 horsepower. Since this engine was recently made available for the 356 Speedster, you may be wondering why I'm not testing that instead. Well, firstly, I had already swapped this one, and secondly, this one doesn't have the option for a rear wing. So I'm definitely doomed for this one, aren't I? As usual, all upgrades are applied, including the body rigidity increase. None of the settings have yet been adjusted, except for the transmission, which has already been set up for this car. I have fitted aftermarket wheels, although without a wide body option, the width of the tyres is the same as stock. I've got a wide offset which can slightly help with stability. The wheels are in the standard size, since increasing the size can make the car more agile but slightly less forgiving. Meanwhile, there are no options for downforce on this car to keep it stable. Wish me luck! If you're interested in learning more about aero, downforce, or any other aspect of tuning your car, I have a series called Tuning for Beginners which covers everything from suspension to differential to the transmission. The chosen track for today was the Nurburgring GP circuit. The car had an average launch. You might expect it to be better given that it's basically a Beetle, but the tyres are very narrow and aren't offering much in the way of grip. However, that's nothing compared to how awful the brakes are. I am convinced that the brakes on this car are in fact milk bottle caps. Surprisingly though, this car isn't as difficult to drive as you might expect. It leans quite a lot in the corners thanks to the usual default frequency settings, however that doesn't seem to be working against the car too much, at least not on this track. Despite missing a few braking points, I did not seem to have any life-altering incidents. Whoops. Which is more than can be said for the Alpine A110 that I tested last time out. For my first adjustments, I increased the anti-roll bars and the natural frequency as usual, though given how the car was easier than usual to drive on its default settings, I wasn't sure that I was going to make the car worse by doing this. Either way, I set both settings higher at the rear because it helped with stability when braking. So, obviously body movement was reduced and the car handled much more flat through the corners. Ooh, Max Verstappen wishes he could get away with that one. This didn't necessarily make the car easier to drive though. It also resulted in something of a trade-off. The car felt generally better at low speeds, but slightly less stable at high speeds. The car felt more willing to change direction due to the stiffer suspension. However, in this case that's not necessarily a good thing because that will reduce high-speed stability, something this car will suffer with massively on the Nurburgring Test. Next up, I performed some more suspension tweaks. I increased compression, which usually helps the car deal with the curbs better. I decreased camber, which should give the car more grip in a straight line, and thus help slightly with braking distances. I then added a heap of front toe out, which should help with high-speed stability, and I added some rear toe in to slightly reduce power oversteer. At this point, I was slightly confused because the 356 got worse. Granted, not by much, but it felt more prone to lift-off oversteer and was less stable at high speed. Brakes were still shit too. This does seem to have become a recurring theme in the Monster Taming series. When I get a car that doesn't have downforce, everything I know goes out of the window. Setting up this car was going to be more akin to throwing shit at a wall. For my final changes, I adjusted the LSD. I increased initial torque to hopefully reduce the car's high-speed agility. I reduced acceleration sensitivity to help with power oversteer, and I reduced braking sensitivity, which usually improves braking performance. I also reduced some of the front toe angle to see if that was causing my high-speed instability. I also matched the rear negative camber to the front. The reason I set the rear lower than the front in the first place was because it usually helps with oversteer when braking. The lift-off oversteer was improved again on low-speed corners, though high-speed stability was still an issue. The brakes were slightly improved, though still mostly atrocious. This car would no doubt need a great deal more fettling before it would be able to take on the Nordschleife. Unsurprisingly, it was terrible, and I spent hours refining the setup, by which I mean lobbing more shit at the wall. Let's just say none of it stuck, so here's a small highlight reel of my failure. Oh, bollocks. Shit. Oh, for fuck's sake. I had to resort to the very cheap method of fitting weaker tyres to the front, same as the Plymouth Superbird and the Abarth 595. I also added rear ballast to improve traction out of corners. It also made the front end slightly more vague at high speed, which helps with the stability issues. Not by much though. So, the Porsche 356. It is a stunning car to look at. It's also a Volkswagen Beetle that's been squashed, and putting an 800 horsepower turbo engine from a supercar up its backside is a bit like strapping a jet engine to a wheelie bin. I'm fairly certain a paper bag full of donuts would handle better than this car. In case it's hard to tell, I don't recommend this engine swap. It is genuinely one of the worst swaps in the entire game. The Abarth 595 at least has the distinction of being so stupid that it's kind of funny. The Superbird, meanwhile, isn't actually made any worse by its engine swap because the car is atrocious to begin with on its standard engine. This is a car that's semi-okay on its standard engine and is utterly ruined by this engine. If we had the option for a wide body, a front chin spoiler and a rear wing like the old muscle cars, this car would be a totally different story. But the engine choice for this car renders it more or less completely useless. The standard engine is capable of roughly 220 horsepower once upgraded, so it's very confusing that Polyphony felt the need to give it an engine capable of almost quadruple that. So what engine would I have chosen? Well, there's several better options than the 959 engine. There's the same Carrera engine that goes into the Beetle, which would probably still be overkill. If not, there's the engine from the 1973 Carrera RS, capable of roughly 450 horsepower. Or, going left field, we could use the engine from the Toyota 86 or Subaru BRZ, since it's a flat 4. But no, we get a hypercar engine. There's 4 cars now available with the 959 engine, and only one of them is worth bothering with, and that is the 1992 Carrera RS, the car whose engine ironically should have gone into this car. So for those who were considering this car or this engine, what do I recommend doing with the 356? I mean, obviously avoid the engine swap like the plague. I'm probably going to sell this bastard thing after the video's done. What I recommend you do is slap on Sports Soft or Sports Medium tyres and tune it to 550 or 580 performance points and do the Clubman Cup or Historic Car Cup races. That way, this car drives much more nicely and has a use at the same time. In the end, the 356 got an astounding 6 minutes 49. Oh hang on, did I say astounding? That's odd. I meant to say shit. So, that was my attempt to tame a monster. I hope my settings helped, or that you enjoyed this video. Join me next time where I'm driving a car that also has a Porsche engine, but isn't rubbish. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're feeling particularly generous, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care of yourself, and ta-ra.